Hello, I'm Jen Lingler from the University of Pittsburgh, and I'd like to begin by thanking Drs. Bendlin and Edwards for the opportunity to share a bit about my research with you. Broadly speaking, the theme of my work falls under the notion of ethical issues in dementia care and research. And this makes sense. In a moment, I'll show you a timeline of my training and career development trajectory. But before getting my PhD, I was a nurse with a master's degree in bioethics. So it's not surprising that most of my work follows into really these kind of three thrusts within the realm of research ethics. So during my postdoc, at that time, the mild cognitive impairment diagnosis was being used frequently in research settings, far less frequently in clinical settings, if at all. And within research settings, a clinical research diagnosis of MCI was not ubiquitously shared back with research participants. I happened to be at the University of Pittsburgh, where this clinical research diagnosis was routinely returned to participants. And so I collaborated with a fantastic medical anthropologist named Marcy Nightingale to do a very small study, but to really sort of listen to the voices of people that had received a research diagnosis of MCI. And the overall goal was to understand how people made sense of this diagnosis, to identify ways of better informing or supporting them following the disclosure of this research diagnosis. And what we learned through these interviews was that understanding MCI, getting sort of a metacognitive perspective, starting to make sense of it for oneself, had both an emotional and a cognitive dimension. And we learned that the emotional dimension was actually fairly varied from participant to participant, and a whole range of emotional responses were represented even within just our small sample. As you can see, those ranged from fear and distress, which were in the minority, to a surprising finding of relief and satisfaction, which typically emerged for people who were expecting even worse news. They found MCI to be somewhat relieving. In terms of the cognitive dimension, this is really some of the work that drove much of my research that followed. There were essentially two camps: those that understood MCI sort of at face value. Well, what do you mean? What does it mean to me? It means that I have mild cognitive impairment. I don't remember well, very face value. There was another group that was much more prognosis focused. And it's really that quote from a participant in the middle of the screen, that quote, "It can change anytime it wants to." That really spoke to me. So sort of leaping forward, what to do about this ambiguity that people are living with. The premise behind our recent randomized controlled trial, the RAISER study, was that giving people the opportunity to learn more about pathological changes in their brain may not be there, in particular, giving them the opportunity to learn the results of their amyloid PET scans, could potentially be empowering, that it could perhaps alleviate some of that sense of ambiguity because it would provide more information about changes that were or were not happening. So cutting to the chase really quickly, this was a negative trial. It ended up being published as a brief report, but our primary hypotheses did not pan out. So just to tee things up for the discussion that's going to follow today, a couple of quick bullet points along this kind of timeline of a research career. One thing you can just, kind of zero in on is that I had a career development award from a private foundation, from the Brookdale Foundation. They were a group that was funding careers in aging research. The award was in 2008. But prior to that, I tried to get a K award. And this is just to illustrate the idea that timing is everything. I had these ideas about, from that early small scale pilot work, about people having misconceptions about MCI. And, what can we do to better their understanding? And again, try to lessen this sense of ambiguity. We didn't have biomarker tests to offer them at that point in time. We wanted to understand the phenomenon. And what we were told was, well, experts don't even agree about what an MCI diagnosis means. So how can you evaluate or study what it means for patients who are impacted? And that was really a foreshadowing. That was the same kind of comment that I would have to be able to address when I proposed the amyloid PET work. You know, well, experts don't even agree upon or know or understand the prognostic utility of amyloid PET and MCI. So how can you talk to participants about what this might mean? And the other, just point in terms of timing being everything, I highlighted some text for you. In 2006, a weakness of this work was in the significance was considered weak. This is all predicated on the unestablished premise that early diagnosis is of great value. Again, timing. Similarly, when we first started proposing, RO1 scale work to study amyloid PET disclosure, we were told by reviewers things like, oh, people will be frightened by this information for no good reason. We were told you might be biased because in your significance section, you're saying amyloid testing is going to lead to a sea change in dementia care and research. Again, that was not necessarily an evident truth to reviewers. I'd like to encourage everyone to make it a personal goal of theirs to eventually be able to assemble and sustain a high functioning research team, because that's what really makes you able to do work that's efficient, impactful, and if you have the right constellation of people, have fun along the way. So huge shout out and thanks to our research team that works on both my amyloid PET disclosure studies and our recruitment innovations work to maximize diversity. And then of course, all of our academic collaborators, including colleagues at Michigan and Washington University. Big thanks to the University of Wisconsin for this opportunity to introduce myself and my research to all of you. I look forward to our conversation.